Okay, so have you ever wondered, like, are there just some things you should, well, just never do, no matter what?
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. Like certain actions are just plain wrong, regardless of the outcome.
Exactly. And that's where we get into this whole fascinating world of deontology. It's all about duty, about what you ought to do.
Right? The word itself comes from Greek, dion, meaning duty, and logos, well, that means study of.
So basically, the study of duty makes sense.
Yeah, it's a big deal in ethics, this whole idea of moral requirements and what's forbidden and what's allowed.
And what sets deontology apart is that it's kind of like the opposite of consequentialism.
Ah, consequentialism, yeah. That's where you judge an action solely by its results. Like, did it lead to the best possible outcome?
Right, so it's all about the consequences. The ends justify the means, as they say. But deontology says, hold on a second. Some things are just off limits, no matter how good the results might be.
Exactly. It's about sticking to those moral rules, those principles, regardless of the consequences. The right comes before the good, so to speak.
And for our listeners out there, think of yourself as the learner, right? Someone who's super curious, loves diving into these big ideas, wants to see different perspectives, but without getting lost in a jungle of jargon.
Yeah, we want to make this clear and engaging, help you have those aha moments.
Exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive into deontological ethics. We'll unpack the core ideas, explore its different forms, see where it shines, where it stumbles, and how it relates to, well, its philosophical rival, consequentialism.
All right, sounds like a plan. Let's start by really examining this fundamental contrast between deontology and consequentialism.
Perfect. So as we've said, consequentialism judges actions based on the results they produce, trying to maximize the good.
Right, but defining that good, that's where things get interesting. Some consequentialists are monists, like many utilitarians.
Monists. Sounds intense.
Basically, they believe there's just one ultimate good to aim for. Could be happiness, pleasure, overall well-being, it varies. The point is, it's all about maximizing that one thing.
So it's like trying to achieve the highest possible score on a universal happiness meter.
Precisely. But then you have pluralist consequentialists who believe in multiple values that contribute to the good. Some even think the distribution of the good matters, or that upholding rights and duties are themselves part of the good to be maximized.
So even consequentialists sometimes try to bring in ideas that seem, well, a bit deontological.
They do, but the core idea stays the same. An action is right only if it leads to the best possible outcome, no matter how you define best. And another key point is that, for consequentialists, the good is agent neutral.
Agent neutral, meaning
It means the good is valuable no matter who achieves it. Everyone's equally responsible for bringing it about, regardless of their role. Saving 5 strangers is inherently better than saving your own child if those are the only options. It's about the overall outcome, not who's doing the saving.
okay, so it's about the big picture, the overall good, regardless of who the actor is. Now, this might sound logical on the surface, but this is where deontologists step in and say, hang on, not so fast.
Right. Exactly. There are some serious objections to consequentialism from a deontological perspective.
So what are the main issues? Why do deontologists push back against this idea of maximizing the good?
Well, one major critique is that consequentialism can be way too demanding. If you're constantly striving to maximize the good, there's no room for actions that are okay but not strictly required. You're either obligated to do something or forbidding from doing it. No room for going above and beyond or just living your life without constantly calculating the best possible outcome.
Yeah, I can see that. It feels almost impossible to live up to that standard. Like, am I morally obligated to dedicate every second of my life to maximizing global happiness? What about my own life, my own pursuits?
Exactly. And the other major issue is that, paradoxically, consequentialism can also seem not demanding enough in other areas. Because it's so focused on results, it seems to allow, even require, actions that we instinctively see as wrong, killing innocent people, lying, breaking promises, if those actions would somehow lead to a greater overall good.
Right, those classic ethical dilemmas come to mind. Like the surgeon who has 5 patients needing organ transplants, and there's one healthy person whose organs could save all 5. A strict consequentialist might say.
Well, they might argue that sacrificing that one person is the right thing to do if it saves 5 lives. The same logic applies to the famous fat man thought experiment, pushing one person in front of a runaway trolley to save 5 others. It's all about the numbers, the greater good.
And that's where most people's moral intuitions scream, no way, that's just wrong no matter how many lives are saved. So how have consequentialists tried to respond to these criticisms, these gut-level objections?
They've come up with several strategies. Some propose satisficing instead of maximizing. So instead of always aiming for the absolute best outcome, you aim for something that's good enough, which allows for some leeway, some room for personal projects and choices that don't necessarily maximize the good.
So it's like setting a lower bar for what counts as morally acceptable.
Right. But then the question becomes, what counts as good enough? Defining that without relying on some underlying deontological principles to protect individuals gets tricky.
It feels a bit arbitrary, doesn't it?
All right.
Like, who decides what's good enough?
Exactly. Another approach is to distinguish between negative duties, things you shouldn't do, like harm others, and positive duties, things you should do, like help others. The argument is that negative duties are stronger, more fundamental. So you have a stronger duty not to kill the one person in those thought experiments than you do to save the five.
It sounds like they're almost sneaking in some deontological ideas through the back door, even though they started out rejecting them.
Right. And then there's indirect consequentialism, which focuses on following rules or developing character traits that tend to produce good outcomes in the long run. So instead of judging every single action by its immediate consequences, you focus on rules like don't kill innocent people.
So you follow the rules, and the good outcomes will generally follow.
That's the idea. They argue it avoids those morally repugnant outcomes of direct consequentialism and isn't as intensely demanding on individuals. But the fact that they're resorting to these strategies just highlights the power of those deontological intuitions. Some things are just wrong, regardless of the potential benefits.
Okay, that's a really helpful backdrop. It seems like deontology arises, in part, as a reaction to these perceived problems with consequentialism. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are the core principles of deontological theories themselves? What makes them tick?
At their heart, deontological theories say that the morality of our choices isn't just about the results. Some choices are inherently wrong, no matter how much good they might produce. For deontologists, it's about upholding those moral norms, those rules, and those rules are meant to be followed, not weighed against potential benefits. It's not about maximizing, it's about doing what's right, period.
So it's about duty, about adhering to a moral law, almost like a fundamental ethical framework that sets the boundaries for our actions.
Precisely. And alongside these obligations, deontologists often talk about permissions. Some things you're allowed to do, even if they don't lead to the best possible outcome. And it's not just that you're not forbidden from doing them, but you're positively allowed to do them. Think about it, even if there was some action that would lead to a tiny bit more good in the world, that doesn't mean you're obligated to do it. There's a space for permissible actions that aren't obligatory.
Okay, so it carves out a space for choices we can make, even if they don't maximize some abstract good. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy talks about two main categories of deontological theories: agent-centered and patient-centered.
Ah, yes, the classic distinction.
Let's start with agent-centered theories. What are they all about? What makes them unique?
Agent-centered theories focus on the individual, on your specific duties and permissions. They say that each person has reasons for acting, both obligations and permissions that are specific to them. These aren't just personal whims, mind you. They're objective reasons, but they're relative to the agent. So what I'm obligated to do might not be what you're obligated to do.
Okay, so it's more personalized view of morality, focusing on my duties, my sphere of action. The encyclopedia mentions this idea that morality is about keeping one's own moral house in order.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Agent-centered theories emphasize individual agency. Your primary concern is with your own actions, your own intentions, not necessarily with preventing others from doing wrong. The focus is on maintaining your own moral integrity. And within this category, there are further distinctions based on what exactly constitutes this morally significant agency. Some theories zero in on your intentions, while others focus more on the actions themselves, and some combine both.
Okay, lots to unpack there. Let's start with those intention-based theories. What's their central claim? What makes them stand out?
Intention-based theories say that what really matters morally is your intended goal and the means you plan to use to achieve it. If your goal itself is something bad, or if you plan to use morally bad methods to achieve even a good goal, that's a no-go. It's about the orientation of your will, your internal commitment.
So your thought process, your deliberate plan, that's where the moral weight lies. Now, the encyclopedia mentions that intention is different from things like belief, risk, and cause. Can you break that down for us? Why is that distinction so important?
Sure. So let's say I predict that my action will have a bad side effect. That's a belief, a judgment about what's likely to happen. But it doesn't mean I'm aiming for that bad outcome. I might be willing to tolerate it, but it's not my goal. Same with risk and cause. I can intend to do something without actually causing a particular outcome, and I can cause something without intending to, like in an accident. Intention is about deliberately aiming for something, setting it as your goal.
Okay, so it's a very specific mental state. And this seems to lead directly to the doctrine of double effect, which pops up a lot in ethical discussions.
You got it. Deontologists who emphasize intention often use the doctrine of double effect. Basically, it says it's wrong to intentionally cause harm, even if it would prevent more harm in the future. But if you only foresee that harm as a side effect of doing something good, then it might be okay, as long as the good outweighs the bad and the bad isn't part of your plan.
So, like giving a terminally ill patient a high dose of pain meds, knowing it might hasten their death, but not intending to cause death, versus deliberately giving them a lethal injection.
Exactly. The key difference is what's directly intended versus what's just a foreseen side effect. Intention is crucial for these theories, and while some agent-centered views might focus on other mental states, like your beliefs about the future or your overall motivations, this focus on intention, on what some call inner wickedness, is pretty essential.
Got it. So that's the focus on intention. What about action-based theories? What do they see as the heart of moral agency?
Action-based theories, while they acknowledge that actions come from mental states, really zoom in on the actions themselves. So your obligations and permissions are all about what specific actions you take. Like, you have a duty not to kill an innocent person. But killing here isn't just about someone dying. It's about a specific action that directly causes that death.
So it's not just about a bad outcome, but about whether my action is the direct cause of that outcome. The encyclopedia talks about distinctions between causings, omissions, allowings, enablings, redirectings, accelerations. Seems pretty nuanced.
Yeah, they really break things down. They'd say, for instance, that causing harm directly is generally worse than just failing to prevent it, like actively pushing someone off a cliff versus seeing them fall and not throwing them a rope.
Okay, so the emphasis is on what I actively do to cause a bad outcome.
Yeah.
What about allowing something bad to happen? That seems tricky.
Allowing, in this context, has a very specific meaning. It's about removing a safeguard that someone had, putting them back in a situation where they're vulnerable to a threat. So imagine you're a doctor and you disconnect life support. You might argue you're not actively causing death, but rather allowing a natural process to take over.
So it hinges on the idea that you're not starting the chain of events that leads to the harm, but just stepping back from preventing it.
Right. And then you have enabling, helping someone else cause harm, like giving them a weapon, and redirecting, like in the trolley problem where you're diverting an existing threat. The idea is that you're not creating the threat, just changing its path.
Got it. And what about accelerating a harm, like making something bad happen sooner than it otherwise would?
Exactly. If someone's already dying and you do something to speed up the process, that might be accelerating rather than directly causing. All these distinctions, causing, omitting, allowing, enabling, redirecting, accelerating, are central to what's called the doctrine of doing and allowing.
It seems like it all comes down to drawing these very fine lines between different types of actions. And the encyclopedia also mentions a third category that kind of blends intention and action. How does that one work?
Yeah, this perspective argues that for an action to be morally problematic, you need both the bad intention and the direct causal link. So it's not just about not killing or not intending to kill, but about not committing murder, intentionally killing someone.
So it kind of raises the bar for what counts as a serious moral violation. You need both the guilty mind and the guilty act.
Precisely. It tries to avoid some of the potential problems of focusing on just one or the other. But now let's talk about some of the challenges that agent-centered theories face. They're not without their critics, you know.
Right. Every theory has its weaknesses. So what are some of the main criticisms leveled against agent-centered deontology?
Well, one common one is that it seems a bit too self-centered. It's all about keeping your moral slate clean, even if it leads to a worse outcome overall. Some people find that, well, kind of morally unattractive.
Yeah, it could lead to a sort of detachment from the bigger picture, couldn't it? Like, as long as I didn't do anything wrong, it doesn't matter if things go badly.
Right. And then there's the issue we talked about earlier with those fine distinctions between intentions, actions, and their variations. Some people argue that those distinctions are either morally irrelevant, like, does it really matter if you intended the bad outcome or just foresaw it? Or just conceptually messy? Like, can you really always draw a clear line between causing and allowing, or between redirecting and initiating a harm?
Feels like you could spend forever debating where those lines should be drawn.
Exactly. And then this leads to another problem, avoidance. Because these theories often focus on very specific intentions or actions, it creates an incentive to get creative with how you describe your actions, to find loopholes in the rules.
Ah, so it becomes a game of linguistic gymnastics to avoid moral blame. Technically, I didn't lie, I just withheld information.
Precisely. Finally, there's this idea of a broad control theory of agency, where you're responsible for anything you could have prevented. And while that might sound comprehensive, it leads to some strange conclusions, like, is failing to save someone from drowning morally the same as pushing them in?
Yeah, that doesn't seem quite right. Okay, so we've explored agent-centered deontology with its strengths and weaknesses. Let's move on to patient-centered theories. What's their main focus? How do they differ?
Patient-centered theories shift the spotlight away from the agent, the one acting, and onto the patient, the one being acted upon. So instead of focusing on your duties, they emphasize the rights of others.
So instead of asking, what am I obligated to do, it's more about what are others entitled to?
Exactly. And a core principle in many of these theories is something called the means principle. It says you can't treat another person as a mere tool to achieve your goals or someone else's goals.
So no using people as stepping stones, even for a good cause. And this seems to address those thorny consequentialist scenarios, like the organ transplant case and the fat man diet.
It does. It forbids using someone's body, labor, or talents without their consent. This idea is really important in various forms of libertarianism, and it shows up in the work of philosophers like Quinn, Alexander, just to name a few. They argue that you don't have a duty to provide benefits that would require infringing on someone's right not to be used.
So in the transplant case, it's wrong because you're using the healthy patient's body to save others. But how does this apply to the trolley problem? Seems like someone's getting harmed no matter what you choose.
Right. But the interesting thing is how this view distinguishes between the cases. In the standard trolley problem, yes, one worker dies if you switch the trolley, but they're not being used to save the others. Their presence on that sidetrack is incidental. It's not essential to how the five are saved. It's a tragic side effect, but not a means to an end.
But in the transplant case, the one person's organs are literally the means by which the five are saved.
Exactly. And it's the same with the Fat Man case. You're using his body to stop the trolley. So this aligns really well with our intuitions about why those cases feel so different.
That's a pretty clear and consistent distinction. It really shifts the focus away from what the agent is thinking or intending and puts it on the relationship between the agent and the person being harmed. And the encyclopedia notes that for patient-centered views, the agent's intentions are less important than whether someone is being used. That's a big difference from agent-centered theories.
Huge difference. While intention might still be relevant when judging the agent's character, the act itself is mainly judged by whether it involves using another person without their consent. So even if the person switching the trolley in that example has some malicious intent towards the worker on the sidetrack, like maybe they have a grudge, the act itself might still be permissible if the worker's harm isn't the means by which the five are saved.
That's a surprising implication. It separates the morality of the act from the morality of the person doing it to a certain extent.
It does. Now, what about those tricky acceleration cases we discussed? Like the lifeboat scenario, where you're stranded with others and someone suggests, well, or the case where soldiers are trapped and someone says, hey, let's use this guy to hold down the barbed wire so we can escape. How does patient-centered deontology handle those?
Yeah, those are tough ones.
If you take that no-using principle really seriously, you'd probably say those actions are wrong. You're directly using someone's body as a means of survival. Agent-centered views, with their focus on causing versus accelerating harm, might be more open to allowing it in those extreme situations.
I see. So it's a very strict constraint. But the encyclopedia points out a potential problem. How does this view explain why it's wrong to harm someone when it's not done as a means to an end? Like, what if someone just kills another person for no reason, just out of pure malice?
Yeah, that's a valid point. A purely no-using approach might need some additional principles, maybe even some consequentialist ideas, to fully explain all types of moral wrongs. After all, killing someone out of spite is clearly wrong, even if you're not using them to achieve some other goal. The no-using principle has its strongest implications in cases where you might otherwise try to justify harming someone by appealing to the greater good.
Makes sense. And then there's the libertarian aspect of this view. The idea that not helping someone isn't the same as using them.
Right. Many proponents argue that you don't have a strong obligation to actively help others in every situation. Forcing people to help could violate their right not to be used. The emphasis is on what you should refrain from doing, not what you're required to actively do.
Now, the encyclopedia brings up this paradox of deontology for those patient-centered theories that see rights as agent neutral. What's that all about?
This version of the paradox pops up if you say that everyone has an equal duty to respect everyone else's rights. Because if that's true, then why wouldn't it be okay, even required, to violate one person's rights if it prevents two or more people's rights from being violated in the same way? If all rights are equal, wouldn't you want to minimize the total number of violations, even if it means breaking the rules once to prevent multiple violations later?
Yeah, that's a real head scratcher. It's like saying it's wrong to violate a right, but it's better to have more rights violated overall.
Exactly. And one way to address this is to argue that patient-centered deontology is actually agent relative. So your primary duty is not to use anyone as a means, period. Not to use John, even if it prevents others from using him or others in the future. It becomes about your individual responsibility, not some global calculation of rights violations.
So it grounds the idea of rights back in individual action.
Okay.
We've covered agent-centered and patient-centered theories. What about contractualist theories? Where do they fit in?
Contractualist theories bring in this whole idea of a social contract or agreement. So what's morally wrong is what would be forbidden by rules that people would rationally agree to or that couldn't be reasonably rejected.
So morality is like a big agreement we all sign on to, either explicitly or implicitly. The encyclopedia mentions some debate about whether this is a normative or a meta-ethical theory. What's the difference and why does it matter here?
If it's a normative theory, it's basically saying, here's how you should act. And in this case, it would probably be a type of patient-centered deontology where your main obligation is to act in ways that others could consent to. But then you run into those classic social contract problems. How realistic is this idea of consent? Do we really consent to all these moral rules?
It feels like we're stretching the idea of consent pretty thin in a lot of cases.
Exactly. That's why many modern contractualists, like Scanlon, see it as a meta-ethical theory. It's not about telling you what to do, it's about explaining what morality is. Like Scanlon says, moral rules are those that we can justify to each other in a way that no reasonable person could reject.
Okay, so it's about explaining the foundations of morality, not necessarily giving you a set of rules to follow. And the encyclopedia points out that even this meta-ethical version doesn't automatically lead to deontology.
Right. Some philosophers think that if you had this ideal social contract, people might actually choose utilitarianism as the guiding principle.
Yeah.
And even if it does lead to deontology, it's not clear if it'd be agent-centered or patient-centered.
So contractualism offers a way of understanding morality, but it doesn't necessarily dictate a specific ethical system. Finally, the encyclopedia emphasizes Kant's huge influence on deontology.
Yeah.
How do his ideas connect to all these different branches we've been discussing?
Yeah, Kant's a major figure here, and it's amazing how all these branches can trace their roots back to him. Agent-centered deontologists love his emphasis on acting from goodwill and following moral principles. Patient-centered deontologists point to his idea that you should never treat people as mere means. And contractualists draw on his idea of universalizability, that moral rules should apply to everyone equally.
So it's like Kant laid the groundwork, and all these modern theories are building on different aspects of his ideas.
Exactly. He was a giant in this field.
Hmm.
Okay, so now that we have a good grasp of the different types of deontology, let's step back and consider, what are its strengths and weaknesses compared to consequentialism?
Yeah, good idea. Let's do a little comparative analysis.
One of the big pluses for deontology is that it makes sense of why we care so much about our loved ones and our own projects. It allows for partiality, which feels more natural than consequentialism's insistence on treating everyone equally, no matter who they are.
Yeah, it makes room for that personal dimension of morality.
Exactly. And it also explains why some actions are praiseworthy, even if they're not strictly required. Consequentialism sometimes struggles with that. If it's not maximizing the good, is it even good at all? Deontology allows for a broader spectrum of moral judgments. And maybe most importantly, deontology fits better with our gut reactions in those tricky moral dilemmas. Most people find those consequentialist solutions, killing one to save five, just instinctively wrong. Deontology captures that sense of wrongness.
Makes sense. And it seems to give a better account of why specific individuals have a right to complain when a moral rule is broken. Like, if I make a promise to you, that creates a duty specifically to you. not just some impersonal obligation to maximize good in the world.
Right. So those are some of the strengths. But of course, there are also weaknesses. One of the big ones is this paradox of deontology we talked about earlier. If it's wrong to violate a moral rule, then isn't it even more wrong to allow more violations to happen? But that seems to imply you should sometimes do bad things to prevent worse things from happening, which sounds kind of consequentialist.
Yeah, that's a tough one. How did deontologists handle that?
One way is to say that you can't just add up moral wrongs like you're adding numbers. Two wrongs aren't necessarily worse than one because you're dealing with different individuals, each with their own moral standing. But this approach runs into trouble when you think about those cases where saving more lives seems clearly better than saving fewer.
Right, it clashes with our intuition that numbers often do matter in morality.
Exactly. Another approach is to accept that breaking moral rules is bad, but to argue that there's a different kind of reason for following the rules, even when it leads to worse outcomes. Like maybe those rules create special protected reasons that outweigh other considerations, but this requires a whole different way of thinking about moral reasons, and it's still a topic of debate.
So it's a problem they're still grappling with. Another big challenge is conflicts between duties. What happens when you have a duty to do two things and you can only do one?
Yeah, that's a big problem for any moral system. Kant said that a true conflict of duties is impossible, which seems a bit optimistic. Agent-centered theories try to avoid conflicts by defining their duties very narrowly. Like in the trolley problem, you might say that neither choice involves directly causing death, so there's no conflict with the duty not to kill. But this can lead to all sorts of tricky loopholes and avoidance tactics where you're technically following the rule but maybe violating its spirit.
It's like finding the legal loophole that lets you get away with something, even if it's morally questionable.
Right. So how do they deal with these conflicts when they do arise? One approach is specificationism. You create super detailed rules with built-in exceptions to handle every possible situation. So instead of don't lie, you get this massive rule book specifying exactly when and how lying is allowed. Critics say it gets way too complicated and could go on forever.
Yeah, it's like trying to create a legal code that covers every single possibility, which is, well, impossible.
Right. Another approach is the idea of prima facie duties. So you have these general duties that apply at first glance, but they can be overridden by stronger duties in specific situations. Like you have a duty to keep promises, but maybe that can be overridden if you have to break a promise to save someone's life.
So it's like a hierarchy of duties.
Sort of,
Huh.
but then the question is, how do you decide which duty wins out in a conflict? If the answer is whichever produces the best outcome, then you're back to consequentialism. If it's based on other deontological rules, you might end up back at specificationism. And there's also debate about whether these prima facie duties are just guidelines for finding the real duty, or if they have their own moral weight.
Okay, so that's another complex area. And then there's the problem of moral catastrophes. Those situations where following the rules seems like it'll lead to utter disaster, like the classic example of torturing one innocent person to save 1,000 others.
Yeah, those scenarios are a real challenge for deontology. The encyclopedia outlines a bunch of responses. Some deontologists just bite the bullet and say, look, doing what's right is paramount, even if the world burns. Others say there's a threshold where the consequences get so bad that you have to abandon the rules. But that raises a whole bunch of questions. Where do you draw that line? What happens when you're right near the threshold? Does it just turn into consequentialism at that point?
So it's trying to find that balance between sticking to principles and avoiding truly catastrophic outcomes.
Exactly. And there are other, even more nuanced approaches. Some say a truly moral person wouldn't even consider violating the rules no matter what. Others say these extreme cases are beyond morality altogether, that we just have to act and hope for the best. And then there's the idea of separating the wrongness of an action from the blameworthiness of the person doing it. So you could say, torturing is wrong, but the person who does it to save 1,000 lives is still praiseworthy.
It seems like they're trying to find a way to hold on to those deontological principles without leading to completely unacceptable outcomes.
Right. And this leads us back to the relationship between deontology and consequentialism. Are they always fundamentally opposed, or can they work together somehow?
Yeah, can you have your cake and eat it too?
Well, some philosophers have tried to find ways to bridge the gap. Like Nagel suggests that consequentialism is about the objective viewpoint, while deontology is about the subjective perspective of the individual agent. But it's tough to combine those two perspectives in a coherent way. Another approach is the side constraint view, where deontological rules act as limits on consequentialist thinking. So you aim for the best outcome, but only within the boundaries set by those rules.
So it's like deontology sets the rules of the game, and consequentialism helps you decide how to play within those rules.
A good way to put it. Now, could you have a purely deontological or consequentialist system that captures all the benefits of both? Some deontologists think it's possible to expand agent relative reasons to cover everything, to create this incredibly detailed set of rules that would mimic the good outcomes of consequentialism. But consequentialists are generally skeptical. And we've already talked about indirect consequentialism, which tries to incorporate deontological principles by saying that following certain rules will generally lead to the best consequences. But that approach has its own set of problems.
So it seems like their core differences make it hard to fully merge them into one unified theory.
Yeah, it's an ongoing philosophical challenge. And then there's this more recent focus on how to deal with uncertainty in deontology. Like, what happens when you're not sure if your action will violate a rule? How much risk are you allowed to take?
Yeah, that's a really important question for real-life decision-making. We rarely have perfect information about the consequences of our choices.
Absolutely. And this area is getting a lot of attention from philosophers right now. Lots of interesting work being done on how deontology and decision theory can be combined.
So it's still an evolving field. Finally, what about the connection between deontological theories and metaethics? That's the branch of philosophy that explores the nature